D&D, Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons! But what is Dungeons and Dragons? If one plays Dungeons and Dragons, but there are neither dungeons nor dragons, then what game are you really playing? How did Dungeons and Dragons go from a hobby that was more likely to get you thrown into a locker, or possibly even put on trial for running some kind of satanic cabal that apparently has penetrated the hearts of the United States government, to a world where those same exact nerds are now multimillionaires who play Dungeons and Dragons in front of a camera on the internet? All of this and more in today's video. That's right, my friends, get your Walkman and your Atari ready. Today we're taking a trip back to the 1980s to discuss the Satanic Panic. The 1980s, the Cold War between the United States and Russia is at its height. President Jimmy Carter is duking it out with former actor Ronald Reagan, and women everywhere seemingly are in competition with one another for who could have the biggest hair. But you see all throughout the United States, a little-known role-playing game called Dungeons and Dragons was beginning to capture the minds of nerds and theater kids everywhere. At this point in the life of Dungeons and Dragons, D&D has gone from just a small pamphlet created and published by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson by their publishing company 2SR, to a full set of books and rules, as in 1978, D&D would release what is known to its fan base as the core rulebook, the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. According to estimates by creator Gary Gygax, Dungeons & Dragons in 1978 had somewhere around 100,000 players, a number that would dramatically jump to nearly 3 million by 1981. But I don't think that even the prophet Gary Gygax himself could have predicted the absolute insanity, the series of events that would thrust Dungeons & Dragons into the mainstream spotlight. By 1980, there was already a little bit of growing moral concern in more rural, Christian, conservative communities over the game Dungeons & Dragons. Many conservative and Christian parents were getting uncomfortable with the idea of their kids playing a violent game involving devils, demons, magic, and monsters. Sounds to me like their kids were just a bunch of little murder hobos. Really though, the Satanic Panic as we know it got its start with two events that took place mere months from each other. November 1st, 1980, Canadian psychiatrist Lauren Pastor released his now controversial and debunked book, Michelle Remembers, the book cataloging his 14 months of therapy sessions for one of his former patients, Michelle Smith, a woman who he would later marry, by the way. In the book, Pastor states that he used a now debunked psychological method called recovered memory therapy to unlock repressed memories from Michelle's childhood. These memories alleging that Michelle was subjected to a number of satanic rituals as a 5-year-old, and she claimed there was a cabal of Satan worshippers that throughout the world used their influences and positions of power to cover up their horrible deeds.
Who are these people?
Well, they're a secret organization, a secret society. A secret society does not reveal the identity of the people or the ways of their practices. I was familiar with this type of society firsthand in Africa, practicing general medicine there. And if one of the members of that society revealed who he was killed instantly.
According to Michelle Smith, the final ritual that she was allegedly exposed to as a child lasted 81 days and supposedly summoned Satan himself, who did battle with Jesus and the Virgin Mary and Michael the Archangel. What is this, some Christian Tumblr kids OC? Hey guys, just gotta interrupt the video real quick to do the YouTuber thing. You see, it's your guys' engagement on this channel by liking and subscribing that allows me to continue to make these videos. So if you want to continue to see more videos from the channel, then please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. It really does help me out, guys. Okay, enough talking. Back to the video. Now, Smith's stories in the book Michelle Remembers would later be completely debunked. Not only were the method used by her therapist, Pastor, highly criticized by the scientific community, but many of the claims made by Smith were ultimately proven to be untrue and a fabrication of her own mind. Not only did Smith's entire family deny any of these claims, but former neighbors, teachers, and friends were interviewed as well. Yearbooks from Smith's elementary schools were reviewed and found that there was no indication of the young lady being absent from school or missing for any lengthy period of time, including this alleged incident of the 81-day non-stop satanic ritual ceremony. However, all of this was way too little too late. Pazder's book would go on to net him hundreds of thousands of dollars, and more importantly, media attention, which he used to fancy himself as an expert in the topic of satanic ritual abuse, or SRA, a topic that very quickly took hold over the nation. Pazder and Smith would spend the next few years telling their story to any late-night host or media outlet that would give them the time of day. Pazder began fancying himself as an expert on SRA, satanic ritual abuse, and began giving conferences and lecture on the inner workings of satanic cults, even going as far as to provide flimsy certifications for law enforcement officers that stated they were capable to investigate instances of satanic cult-like crimes. As we will see later on in this video, this unlikely alliance between the psychological field, law enforcement officers, and conservative religious communities would ultimately lead to a fearful spread of misinformation and hundreds of instances of false allegations of satanic ritual abuse. Meanwhile, though, just a year prior to this book being released, another event would take place in Michigan that would ultimately place Dungeons & Dragons on trial in the court of public opinion. Enter into our story, prodigy James Dallas Egbert III, or Dallas. Dallas, as I said, was a child prodigy who in 1979 was enrolled at Michigan State University in the computer science program at the staggering age of 16. On August 15, 1979, Dallas would go missing from his dormitory. Reportedly, he left a note stating his intention to delete himself. 1 week later, on August 22nd, Egbert's parents would hire a private investigator, William Deere, to potentially locate their son. 2 days later, Michael Stewart, a journalist for the local university paper, published details of the disappearance of Dallas and a reported theory from police as well as the private investigator, which quickly caught the mainstream media's eye. You see, during the investigation of Dallas's disappearance, the private investigator Deere would come to learn that the young Dallas was an avid lover of Dungeons & Dragons. Deere would come into the spotlight during this investigation as he would be the main proponent that would put forth a theory that Dallas's disappearance was somehow linked to Dungeons & Dragons. You see, according to Deere, when investigating Dallas's room, he found a corkboard that was laden with a strange series of pushpins. William Deere, in his 1984 book, The Dungeon Master, and in subsequent interviews, said that the shape resembled a building that was part of a network of underground campus steam tunnels, which apparently students would like to explore, some of them even reportedly playing Dungeons & Dragons in said tunnels. The PI, along with several volunteers, scoured said university tunnels but could find no trace of Dallas anywhere. Media outlets across the United States began running wild with this idea that somehow this child prodigy had gone missing, seemingly influenced by this strange dark fantasy game called Dungeons & Dragons, as people everywhere began to believe that Dungeons & Dragons had a negative psychological effect on children, and that D&D was somehow an indoctrination recruiting tool for elitist Satan worshippers all across the country to get their hands on young kids. Of course, in reality, what actually happened to Dallas was much more tragic than anything the media could cook up. Dallas, on August 15, 1979, had ventured into the university steam tunnels with plans to delete himself, taking a large dose of a hypnotic sedative. However, this did not work. The following day, Dallas would wake up from his drug-induced sleep, and in a panic and a state of mental disarray, would go into hiding at one of his friends' homes. He stayed there for a series of days until eventually he caught a bus to New Orleans. There, Dallas again attempted to delete himself via cyanide, but this too also failed. Subsequent days later, Dallas would eventually contact William Deere, informing him of his location and asking him to pick him up and take him home. Dallas would reveal all of the details of his disappearance to Deere and explaining to him that Dungeons & Dragons had nothing to do with his disappearance. However, he made the PI promise not to reveal any details of his story, which William Deere did honor, well, until the release of his book in 1984. Dallas, being a minor at the time, would be released into the custody of his parents. However, tragically, a year later, on August 10th, 1980, James Dallas Egbert III would die of a self-inflicted gunshot wound at Grandview Hospital in his hometown of Dayton, Ohio. The disappearance of Dallas and the media frenzy that ensued is really regarded by many as the first real catalyst point for the Satanic Panic, the moral panic of Dungeons & Dragons in the 1980s. Dallas's story would go on to inspire the novelist Rona Jaffe to release Mazes and Monsters only a year after his death in 1981, a cautionary tale depicting a young college student who experiences a psychotic break from reality brought on by tabletop role-playing games. This book is f***ing wild and was even made into a 1982 4TV movie titled Monsters and Mazes, starring Tom Hanks of all people, and I actually did an entire video on this movie, and I highly recommend that you go check it out, because this movie was an absolute clusterfuck. Of course, just a few months after Dallas's death, as we said already, the book Michelle Remembers, written by the psychiatrist Lawrence Pazdur, would be released. Pazdur really putting forth this theory that Dungeons & Dragons, as well as rock and metal music, were tools just to indoctrinate children into a satanic cult. And that all around the United States, nay, even I say the world, there was a cabal of a network of evil elitists worshipping Satan, who allegedly were responsible for the deaths of thousands of children every single year. Now, you might be asking yourself, okay, if there were apparently thousands of children being killed and disappearing every single year at the hands of some elitist satanic cult that were sacrificing children, certainly there would be proof, or at the very least there would be, maybe a few bodies? Well, you see, the conspiracy theorists are way ahead of you. They already have a counter to this point. It's simple, really. Everyone's in on it. From the media, who refuse to report on apparently all these deaths of these children, to the morticians and crematorium employees who hide/cover up the bodies and these deaths. It was apparently an elite, in-depth operation that penetrated the very heart of the United States government. Again, doesn't this all sound rather familiar?
They literally crawl out from under rocks. They have green looking skin and they run around screaming, "We love Satan, we wanna eat babies." I have them on video.
With the blueprint laid out by the psychiatrist Pazdur in Michelle Remembers, these allegations of the satanic ritual abuse began to spread like wildfire across our country. Throughout the 1980s, there were several high-profile court cases that allegedly involved SRA satanic ritual abuse, probably most famously the 1983 McMartin preschool trial in California. Mother Judy Johnson would come forward with allegations that her son was abused by Ray Bucky, a preschool teacher at McMartin Elementary. The cops would question Bucky, but refused to press any charges due to a lack of evidence. However, that didn't stop them from sending a controversial letter to nearly 200 parents of students at McMartin Elementary, asking parents to question their children about Mr. Bucky and his suspected conduct. Yeah, you see, this letter, which encouraged all of these parents to interrogate their children about a potential teacher abusing them, led to several hundreds of kids being interviewed by an LA-based organization called the Children's Institute International, and by the spring of 1984, it was alleged that over 360 children had been abused at this elementary school. Of course, years later, the questioning techniques that were used by this psychological institution would come under fire, as many experts years later, like the clinical psychologist Michael Maloney, believed that the techniques used by the institution were, at the very least, coercive and problematic, and led to false accusations and even possible instances of false memory syndrome, which is most likely what happened with the case of Michelle Smith in the book Michelle Remembers. The claims put forward from this questionable questioning technique, along with reinforcement from the media, churches, and police as to the validity of an actual satanic cabal conspiracy, led to some outrageous accusations. Aside from the very obvious serious criminal allegations, it was said that children were said to have seen witches flying over the school, that some of the children had been taken away in hot air balloons, and that the teacher Bucky and his satanic cohorts were using a series of tunnels beneath the school to conduct their blasphemous rituals, though no such tunnels were ever found. Surprise, surprise. It was even claimed by none other than the mother who started all of this, Judy Johnson, that Ray Bucky had the ability to fly. Of course, it would later be revealed that Miss Johnson suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, and she would later die in 1986 before the preliminary hearing of Ray Bucky had even concluded. Ultimately, Bucky himself would go on to spend a total of 5 years in jail over the course of 2 separate trials, which ultimately ended on July 27, 1990, with Bucky being acquitted of all charges. But of course, by this time, the damage was very much done. The media over the course of these 7 years of this court case had an absolute field day, as most reports, especially from LA-based publications, were extremely uncritical and accepting of the prosecution's viewpoint that there was some sort of satanic cabal conspiracy reaping havoc on the youth of LA. You know what they say, sensationalism sells, and it probably also doesn't help that the editor of the LA Times at the time was engaged with the chief prosecutor overseeing the Bucky case. Conflict of interest, anyone? 1985 would see the founding of the organization BAD, or Bothered by Dungeons and Dragons, by psychiatrist Thomas Radecki, a man who cited a fictitious letter written by a character in the book Mazes and Monsters as proof that Dungeons and Dragons has caused the death of its players, as well as mother and activist Patricia Pulling, whose son, an avid Dungeons and Dragons player, had deleted himself in 1982, something that she blamed on Dungeons and Dragons. Bothered by Dungeons and Dragons, BAD began hard peddling this narrative that D&D encouraged devil worship and was the kind of indoctrination for kids into a satanic cult. Patricia Pulling even once went on the record to say that 8% of the population of Richmond, Virginia were Satanists. Now, just for reference to see just how insane this claim is, in the 1980s, Richmond, Virginia had a population roughly around 600,000 people. 8% of 600,000 is 48,000. So you're telling me that in the 1980s, there was over 48,000 Satanists in Richmond, Virginia, of all places, alone? And what do you think that Miss Pulling's source was to this claim?
Nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the f*** up.
Of course, Pulling and BAD as an organization wasn't alone in peddling these baseless claims. Most famously, conservative pundit Geraldo Rivera produced a television special claiming that there are over 1 million Satanists in the United States that are linked in a highly organized and secret network. Rivera's show was just one of a number of shows that were parroting similar claims on TV in the 1980s. These shows and these talking points being taken and used by religious fundamentalists, cops, and psychotherapists everywhere to further promote and reinforce this idea of a rampant satanic cult in their communities. For context, the US government took this panic and these claims so seriously that the US Center for Disease Control investigated the links between fantasy role-playing games and deleting yourself. Ultimately, they would come to the conclusion, surprise, surprise, that there were no causal links between the two. But the fact that they even had to do the studies in the first place goes to show you just how deeply ingrained the moral panic was in the United States population. Ultimately, though, and more ironically and hilariously, was the fact that the satanic panic of the 1980s and the demonization of Dungeons and Dragons by conservatives and Christian fundamentalists alike really is the sole reason why Dungeons and Dragons probably is as popular as it is today, as all of this media attention thrust D&D into the spotlight. By 1987, Gary Gygax, the creator of D&D, estimated that nearly 5 million people were playing Dungeons and Dragons, and by the early 2000s, this number would reportedly jump to nearly 20 million, according to the BBC. By the late 1990s, the moral panic surrounding Dungeons and Dragons had basically evaporated. BAD as an organization had completely really dissolved, and the moral outrage began shifting away from rock and metal music and Dungeons and Dragons to violent video games and film. Today in 2024, the closest thing that you're going to hear to this kind of rhetoric over Dungeons and Dragons and SRA are insane nut jobs obsessing over a pizza joint in Washington, D.C.
Vampire pot and the goblins are hobbling round coming after us. My spirit gets close to that evil and I feel it go.
In hindsight, the Satanic Panic is just one of many moral panics that have taken place throughout the course of human history, whether it was the witch hunts of historical Europe or the anti-communist McCarthyism that took hold of the United States post-World War II. In general, all moral panics across history kind of feed off of the same thing: fear.
Now, we've been clowning a lot of people who got lost in this Satanic Panic sauce, but ultimately, at the end of the day, the average Joe Schmo who got wrapped up in this conspiracy, I don't really hold them too much to blame. Many of these people, such as the woman who started the organization Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons, were primed to believe this sort of conspiracy theory, whether it was through personal trauma or their religious conservative backgrounds. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think the blame lies squarely with the media, the psychiatrists, and law enforcement, who very biasly pushed these claims of a great satanic cabal. Overall, though, and most hilariously, the Satanic Panic of the 1980s actually ended up having the exact opposite effect as its propaganda intended. Instead of destroying Dungeons & Dragons, all that media attention ultimately allowed Dungeons & Dragons to grow to the mainstream popular behemoth that it is today. According to Wizards of the Coast, 2020 was Dungeons & Dragons' best year ever, with an estimated 50 million players worldwide, a number that seemingly only intends to grow higher. So the next time you sit down to do a little bit of role-playing, to throw a little bit of dice with your friends, or to watch your favorite group of nerdy-ass role players play some Dungeons & Dragons on your computer, let's give a silent thanks to Lawrence Pazder, Rona Jaffe, and all the folks over at BAD, and really all the other whack jobs out there who peddled this narrative, as without them, who knows if Dungeons & Dragons would ever reach the absolute mainstream behemoth heights that it has today. So thanks, guys. As always, guys, if you enjoyed the video and learned something new, please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, as your engagement on these videos really does help to grow the channel and allows me to continue to make these videos. If you did enjoy this video, then why don't you check out one of the videos on screen now. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one. Stay safe out there, drink your water, hug your mother. Until next time, peace, love, Adu.
Yeah, some of the best albums of all time. If I was you, would download Bill for Cuban links.